I started to lose the kind of small amount of money I'd built up very quickly, and I panicked. And I put a whole series of kind of speculative bets on, and suddenly that money had become £58,000, which is obviously an extraordinary amount of money. It can change most people's lives, but to me at that moment in my life, it honestly felt like nothing. So the following day, out of desperation, I did the most stupid thing. And I decided to put it all on one bet, one horse in one horse race. And I said to myself at that point in my life that if that horse was to win, I'd win the money back. Yes, I might lose my house and my job, but at least I'm not in prison. Life can continue. But if that horse loses, there's no way I can possibly tell anybody what I've just told you, and I'm going to go and kill myself. My childhood was amazing. I was so fortunate in my background, my education. I had a very loving, supportive family. I was actually, you wouldn't believe it looking at me, but I was born and brought up in Kenya. So I spent the first few years of my life there, and life was pretty good. Had very loving parents, older sister, younger brother. Always from a young age had been kind of obsessed with sport. That was what I spent most of my time doing. Obviously a very outdoor lifestyle. Then when we moved back to the UK when I was 6, as I say, all I wanted to ever do was play sport. Unfortunately for me, I was pretty good at it. But cricket was the thing that I was sort of best at. I got pulled out of school cricket. I got the opportunity to kind of pursue that dream on an academy. I spent my final 4 years at school combining studies with essentially preparing for a life in professional sport. And that dream became a reality when I was 18, when I signed a professional cricket contract and started to get paid to do what I loved. Things continued to go pretty well on that front until in 2016, I made a difficult decision to go to university to continue my studies, but essentially combine the two. And obviously that was when gambling became part of my life, and life went in a slightly different direction. One sort of Saturday morning, a couple of weeks after Freshers Week, a bit hungover from the night before, a few of my mates came and knocked on the door. They said they were going down to what they called the bookies. I didn't really know what they were talking about, but of course I didn't want to admit that. And we walked into a betting shop in Durham where I was at university. I didn't really know what I was doing. They all did. But when I walked into this shop, weirdly, it fascinated me. I loved everything about it. There was sport all over the TV screens. There was a real sort of rush and buzz in there. And I kind of just stood there watching what people were doing. I watched a guy play on a machine for a while called a fixed odds betting terminal. He was playing a game called roulette. I sort of watched him feed £20 notes into this machine for about 15 minutes, eventually punch it, kick it, storm out the shop, and I sort of laughed it off and thought, what's wrong with him? Obviously, little did I know, and I sat down in this chair. I put £2 in the machine because it was in my pocket from the night before. There was only one number on a roulette machine that was different from the others. So me being me, I thought, what are the chances of that happening? I put it all on green zero, and as I always say, 12 seconds later, £2 became £72, but more significantly, my life changed forever. I mean, I can never explain to people the feeling that gave me. I'd never had it before. The irony is I'd never have it again. I spent the next 13 years essentially trying to chase that feeling with no success. But one thing was for sure was that I loved that feeling, and I just wanted it over and over again. But I didn't appreciate that pretty much from that moment on for the next 13 years, a day wouldn't go past where I didn't do it in some form. I wasn't addicted immediately. Nobody is. But I certainly was hooked. The fact that I'm so competitive and my first bet was a winning bet was definitely significant, because it made me think that was going to happen all the time, but also it felt like a drug for me, because it was all about winning and losing. And as somebody who's so competitive, it gave me that on tap. So from that moment on, I started to do it a lot. The difference was when I first started to do it at university, it was time and money that I could afford to lose. I had a bit more money than some people because I was being paid to play cricket. So it wasn't huge sums of money. I wasn't spending the time where I should have been in the library working the nets, practicing my cricket, or the gym training. It wasn't impacting that area of my life at all. So it wasn't a problem, so to speak, but I certainly did it a lot. But I also did it mainly with other people. And I think one of the big changes was when it started to become secretive, when I started to do it with other people and then 2 or 3 times a day do it on my own. And that happened pretty quickly, actually. The biggest turning point for me was a year later, was when my cricket career came to an end. It would be easy for me to say that my cricket career came to an end because of my gambling and I had a gambling addiction. That was not the case. My cricket career came to an end because I probably wasn't good enough. I'd been found out. Obviously, I had a distraction in my life that I probably didn't need, and it certainly didn't help. But it was that moment where life really changed, because that moment hit me really hard. And I found it really, really difficult to come to terms with the fact that everything that I'd ever wanted, that I'd had a little taste of, was gone. One day I was a professional cricketer, the next I was not. And I had sort of grown up being the person that had never struggled with anything, really. So I didn't really know how to deal with it, and I certainly didn't want to admit it to anybody. I went back to university. To a degree, I put on a pretense that I didn't really care. Of course I did. And it was then that gambling started to play a different part in my life, because firstly, it was the closest thing I could find to kind of replicate the rush and buzz that I used to get from playing sport. But also it became a form of escapism. It was a way of kind of dealing with emotions, a way of kind of running away from how I was feeling. Because when I was gambling, I didn't think about anything else. And I found that really addictive. I never really knew what I wanted to do with my life unless it was playing sport. And so when I finished at university, I was at a little bit of a loss. And I probably made the mistake at that point of kind of following the crowd and doing what everybody else was doing. And I moved to London because I had a degree, a CV that allowed me to get a job in finance, and got paid relatively a pretty big salary for my age. And actually the worst thing about it for me is now I had access to that money, but also I had a huge amount more freedom than I'd ever had before. In London, there were these shops everywhere that I could go to on my lunch breaks after work. There were bars I could go to all evening, casinos all night. And really for the first time in my life, I didn't have anybody kind of looking over my shoulder telling me what to do or what not to do, which is what I'd had in most of those other environments. And I didn't know how to manage my money and the temptations. And it was at that point that I started to gamble a huge amount. I used to gamble a lot on sport because it was the thing that I loved. I knew a fair bit about, and I started to get very into horse racing, which I became, I guess, reasonably knowledgeable about. And so I used to do a lot of that. And then I also used to go into shops physically and play on these machines. I used to play roulette more than anything else, usually combined with watching the horse racing and betting on the same time. My job in insurance allowed me to be out of the office a lot. So I would get my work done very, very quickly, and then I would go and sit in a betting shop in the middle of the city. in terms of kind of the amounts of money that I was gambling, it wasn't ridiculous amounts of money like it became later on, but it was still more money than I could probably afford to lose. But the nature of gambling means you have good days and bad days. I won, I lost, but generally everything that I won, I would reinvest, in inverted commas, into gambling. And if I won a certain amount of money, the next bet I'd place would be bigger. That was kind of the pattern of my gambling. To most people, it appeared that I was successful and nobody really knew how much I was gambling. People knew I gambled, but they didn't know how much I was doing it because I was keeping so much of it kind of secret. And then in 2010, life would change again one night when I had a huge win. And that really was the kind of catalyst for my addiction and everything changing, literally in the blink of an eye. One night when I'd arranged to meet some mates in a bar in central London, I think I suggested the bar because I knew that there was a William Hill betting shop 2 doors down. It was a Wednesday night. There was some Champions League football on. And of course, I wanted to put a bet on. So I got there a few minutes early. I walked downstairs to this shop. I'd had some good news at work. So I thought, you know what? Got a bit more money. I'm going to put a big bet on. And I did. I put the biggest bet I'd put on to that point by distance on a series of football matches, on a football accumulator. And I basically went upstairs, started getting drunk with my mates, didn't really think anything of it. And then on my way home, checked the results and they'd all come in. And that night, £500 became just shy of £35,000. Most people who won that amount of money or had something similar would, the first thing they'd do is they'd ring everybody, they'd tell everybody, they'd put it all over social media these days. I didn't tell anyone because to me it was like, well, then people will find out how much I'm gambling. Everybody will kind of keep a close eye on me, whereas actually now I've got essentially £35,000 to gamble with and make even more money. And it was at that point really that it changed, because then I thought I was invincible. I also kind of thought now every time I gambled, I could win that amount of money. If I didn't, well, it doesn't matter. It's happened before. It's bound to happen again. In the short term, I didn't need the money because I wasn't struggling financially. But actually, the worst thing about it, which I now understand, is then it became like a drug that you take, because then if I didn't win that amount of money, it didn't give me the same kind of rush, the same buzz, the same hit. And I started to basically overnight increase my stakes. My bets went from £20 to £200, £50 to 500, £100 to 1,000 overnight because I had it. And I never told a single person in the world I won that money that night. And that was quite hard. But what was harder was I'd lost it in 4.5 weeks. And of course, then when you lose it, the first thing you want to do is get it back. And so I tried to win it back as quickly as possible. And then I started to lose even more quickly. And it was then that I started to feel guilty, embarrassed, ashamed, feelings that aren't easy to deal with. And then I started to combat those emotions and deal with it by drinking a lot of alcohol, by taking drugs in secret. And then life started to spiral in a very, very different direction pretty quickly.
Hi, welcome to Deep.
This channel goes a level deeper.
Deep is a brand new YouTube channel that is dedicated to the amazing experiences of incredible individuals.
We basically try and answer the questions that you always want the answer to, but you don't feel like you can ask.
Myself and the team are responsible for a lot of the factual content that you might have seen on YouTube, Minutes With, The Gap, Agree to Disagree, among others. And we set up this new studio and this new channel to go a level deeper.
We will be uploading a new video every single week.
There'll be a wide range of stories, so please hit the subscribe bell.
Please let us know in the comments if there's anything you want us to cover, any stories that you've been interested in, any questions you wanted to ask.
We hope you enjoy. Now back to our story.
my sole intention was to try and get myself out of the mess that I had got myself into. And I thought to myself, do you know what? All I need to do is kind of win the money back that I've lost, and then I'll stop gambling, because this isn't good for me or good for anybody else. And I definitely recognize that. But of course, the difficulty was now is that I couldn't stop. And so then in kind of 6 months later, in December 2011, I decided that actually I needed to get out of London. I took the decision to move out of London and become a teacher. The main reason I did that was because my family were all in teaching. I knew people wouldn't think it was strange. People wouldn't ask as many questions. I had the opportunity at that point to say, look, this has happened. I'm in this situation. This is why I'm doing it. But I couldn't bring myself to be honest. I didn't want people to be angry. I didn't want people to be disappointed. I didn't want people to know I'd made mistakes. And I certainly didn't want to tell them it was gambling. And that was part of the problem. Is I just thought, well, it's gambling. Firstly, I should be able to stop when I want. But also I thought, well, people will just think I'm an idiot. And of course, now I understand that actually it's very different to that. But that's the biggest regret. And at that point, if I'd done something about it, if I'd told people, my life would probably look very different. As a teacher, I came across my first holiday, which is brilliant for most teachers. But for me, it was the worst time, because I'm somebody who's not good with time on my hands. I hate being bored. And suddenly I had whole days where, what do I do? How do I fill it? And it was gambling. So I started to do it more and more again. There was also a financial driver to it, which I realize now is so stupid. But I thought to myself, well, maybe I can use gambling to get myself out of the debt that I've got. But also other things started to happen and go wrong in my life. And now gambling again was kind of playing a different part. And I think the problem with any addiction is when you're faced with anything that's difficult, any sort of challenge or adversity, you run away and you escape to what weirdly feels to you like a safe place, but it's actually the most dangerous place you can be, because when you're doing it or using, you're not really engaging reality, you're not thinking about anything else, and you live in this little bubble. And it was my happy place, which sounds extraordinary, but it was, when actually deep down I was pretty unhappy. Any money that I had that wasn't for things that I had to pay would go on gambling. But then as time went on, and actually pretty quickly, then it started to eat into those things. So then I started to obviously borrow money in all sorts of ways. I'd taken out bank loans, I'd maxed out credit cards. And once that had run out, it was then like, okay, what do I do now? How do I fund it now? I've got to pay off debts. I've got to pay bills. And it was then that I started to turn to things like payday loans, which are obviously incredibly dangerous and financially damaging in so many ways. I'd gamble all that away. And then it was at that point that, out of desperation, I started to turn to individuals in quite an extraordinary way. I would tell them anything and everything. Obviously all lies, never the truth, because all that money was going on gambling or to deal with the consequences of gambling. Often it was things like something's happened to my car, or I've been to the dentist and I've got to have some sort of surgery, or the tax man's hit me with an unexpected bill. I recycled quite a few too, to different individuals, ones that had worked previously. And I just became very good at hiding it. And I think because I was the sort of person that actually I think people liked, people respected, I was believable. I'd lost my morals, my values, my principles, I did things that I just would never do. I can't believe that I did. But nothing would get in the way of my addiction or me having a bet. It wasn't about how much money I won or lost or the outcome. It was about being in the bet. And that's what the addiction was. And at that point, I'd kind of hit self-destruct button anyway, because I was a bit like, well, I'm in that much trouble financially. I'm never going to get myself out of it. So I might as well, for want of a better phrase, blow myself up. And I remember times where I'd lost everything. I was kind of in my car. I'd be head on the steering wheel, floods of tears, thinking, right, you've got to stop. You can never do this again. And within the next minute, I was either trying to find more money in order to gamble, or I was gambling in some form. And that's what's really scary about it, is that I had lost the ability to make that choice. And the way I started to do it was I started to make decisions at work that I'd regret forever and would ultimately cost me my career, because I started to approach parents of pupils that I taught for money. I wasn't stupid. I knew some of these people, because of the type of school I worked in, were wealthy people who probably had the money to lend me that they didn't need. And I told them lies. People liked me, respected me. They were ultimately worried about me. They had the money to lend me. I was promising to pay them back, but I couldn't because I was gambling all away. That was kind of how I funded my addiction. But also, I think a lot of people think, well, the one way to spot sign of a gambling addict is, well, if they've got no money. I always had money because I was borrowing huge sums of money off people. So whenever I needed to buy a round of drinks, whenever I needed to go out for a meal and pay for it, I was able to do that. The difference was it wasn't my money. My rock bottom came in 2018, March 2018, when it was at the point where I kind of knew that there wasn't a way out, because too many people had now become aware of what was going on and had started to ask questions. But also that coincided with the school finding out what was going on, because rightly so, they'd received complaints from people. I knew I was going to lose my job, and I knew, because of some of the things that I'd done that other people didn't know about, that I could potentially go to prison. I kind of panicked, and it got really desperate for me. The irony of a gambling addiction, which is, I think, the only thing that is different from other addictions, is the only thing you ever think is going to solve it is the thing that's caused it in the first place. And because of the type of person I am, which I've touched upon, I thought to myself, well, all I need to do is win the money back. If I can win the money back, it will get rid of the problem, because I can suddenly pay everybody back. I mean, I thought at the time when I was doing it, I thought it was the best part of £500,000. The reality was it probably wasn't quite that much, but that's the figure that I had in my head. And I honestly and stupidly believed that I could do it. And part of this perfect storm was that by chance, it was also at that point the start of the Cheltenham Horse Racing Festival, which is the biggest horse racing festival in the world. And I honestly but stupidly believed I could turn that money into what I thought needed to be £500,000. So I rang somebody up. I borrowed some money, having told them a lie I'm not proud of. Quite hard for me to admit, actually. But I said to that person, look, desperately need this money, but I'll pay you back at the end of the week, because I thought, well, I can do it this week. And so during the festival in 2018, I gambled all day, every day. Literally, I won, I lost. I can never explain how stressful it was, this kind of emotional roller coaster that I was on. And then on the Thursday, I started to lose the kind of small amount of money I'd built up very quickly. And I panicked. And I put a whole series of kind of speculative bets on that not even I thought had a chance. But it was kind of a last ditch attempt to salvage the situation. And I then had one bit of luck, which I don't think will ever happen again. And suddenly that money had become £58,000, which is obviously an extraordinary amount of money. It can change most people's lives. But to me at that moment in my life, it honestly felt like nothing. So the following day, out of desperation, I did the most stupid thing. And I decided to put it all on one bet, one horse in one horse race. And I said to myself at that point in my life that if that horse was to win, I'd win the money back. Yes, I might lose my house and my job, but at least I'm not in prison. Life can continue. But if that horse loses, there's no way I can possibly tell anybody what I've just told you, and I'm going to go and kill myself. And I actually watched that horse race sat in a lesson. I had 18 pupils sat in front of me who were doing some work in complete silence. I sat behind the school computer pretending nothing was happening. I watched the horse come second by a couple of lengths and my whole world come crashing down. It was the weekend. It was actually my birthday that weekend. I had an awful lot of family coming up. And I thought to myself, I can't do it now. Somehow. And I still will never understand how I got through those few days, but I managed to. And actually, it was probably the least I ever gambled in those 13 years. Because I didn't want to do it anymore. I'd had enough. I took myself to a train station. I bought a ticket to London with some money I think I'd stolen off my girlfriend. And I basically went onto a train platform with the intention of throwing myself in front of it. As you can imagine, stood there, I had an awful lot going through my mind. But one thing going through my mind more than it ever had before, thank goodness, is you've got to tell somebody. The only person I could bring myself to tell at that moment in some way was my brother, who's my best mate. I didn't want to call him. I didn't want him in the state that I was in. I also didn't want him to know how close I was to doing it, which in hindsight probably means that it was a real cry for help. Of course it was. But I basically said to him, this is what I'm about to do. And fortunately for me, about a minute later, he sent me a text message, and that text message, although he does now, he didn't realize at the time, but it saved my life. And it was very him. He said to me, look, he said, I'll never understand what can be that bad, but don't you dare do what you're about to do. He said, for goodness sake, whatever's going on, he said, you've got to talk. You've got to be open. You've got to be honest. And I promise you, we're all going to stand by and support you. And that's all I needed to hear. So I stood back. I didn't do what I was about to do. The best decision I ever made. As I was stood there in floods of tears, people looking at me, laughing at me, you couldn't make it up. I can honestly say it was the first time in pretty much my whole adult life I felt really good. I felt real. I could stop living this lie, and I could finally get the help that deep down I was so desperate for. And the next day my parents arrived, and then I came clean. And I decided that the only option was to tell them everything. I can never explain how hard it was, but the difference was their reaction was so different to what I thought it was going to be. I'd played in my head for goodness knows how many years that everybody was going to go mad. People were going to disown me. Nobody did. They recognized I had a serious problem. They were glad I was still here. But actually, the one thing that will stick with me forever is they did look me in the eyes and they said, look, we're going to support you, but you've got to play your part in it as well. The priority at that point was obviously to sort myself out, to stop gambling, and to get myself in a situation where I was essentially mentally stable, and then deal with everything else. I then had a conversation with somebody who had been through an addiction, a drug addiction. It was actually the lady who I went to get support from. I went to her treatment centre in London, but I had a phone conversation with her that day, and that was the difference. It was the first person that I had ever spoken to who understood what I'd done, what I'd been through, the way I was feeling, and gave me hope because she reassured me that she'd been there, she'd done that, and that she was now in a very different place. And a lot of people say the opposite of addiction is connection for very good reason. And so that gave me hope that there was a way out. The initial stages of that process of treatment were really, really hard. I had to have a long, hard look at myself in the mirror. I had to accept what I'd done. I had to own it. But the most important thing about those early stages, other than being in a protected environment where I couldn't physically do it and access it, was to start to understand my addiction. And that was a long process. I wanted a quick fix. I'll never be cured, something that I deal with every day for the rest of my life. And I just have to take it one day at a time. But those few weeks allowed me to start that and begin that journey. I don't have the same urges and temptations as I once had. I mean, I get constant reminders that I could do it. I'm never far away from it, but I don't have to deal with it in the same way that I did in the early stages. I also know that I'm somebody who can't, and I'm at peace with that now. 6.5 years now, so 22nd of March 2018. Since then, I've been gamble free and intend to be for the rest of my life. But every day that goes past, it gets easier. I don't think about it as much. The nature of what I do now and sharing my story most days means that I do remind myself of where I was and never want to be again. But also I don't want to be defined by it. And I'd rather be defined by my recovery than my addiction.